You are at the, your name is Benjamin Studebaker, clearly, and you're a political theorist, and I wanted to discuss sort of, I suppose, yes, political theory, but to narrow it down a bit, sort of developments in the political in political theory among left and right that we've seen in like the last 10 years or so. But before we get into that, you want to give a bio? I believe you're at the University of Cambridge, correct?
I did my PhD at Cambridge, yeah, which I've finished up.
And I can't believe I have to ask this. Is that Cambridge, England, or Massachusetts?
England, yeah, at the University of Cambridge in the UK.
Okay, cool. Now I've seen a couple of recent writings of yours, and I know you have a book out, but I admit I focused a bit more on the writings I've seen. You had one at Compact discussing, I believe, sort of pre-modern, to some degree, pre-modern political thinking of a monarchist sort. And then I reached out to you based on an article you'd written, or more of a post, I believe, at your website about rump versus fallen professionals. That's your terminology. And that has implications for what we call PMCs. So that's fairly broad, kind of old, 18th century politics, and then brings us up to the PMC question, brings us up to certain debates happening now. But where would you say your general orientation is politically? Is it vaguely Marxist? That's the impression I get.
Well, I have a number of different major influences. Marx would certainly be one. I get a lot out of Plato. I do a podcast, Political Theory 101, where we do lots of different political theorists from all sorts of different parts of the spectrum. I'm interested in a very, very broad range of things. So I wouldn't say that I'm exclusively interested in one tradition or that I'm positioned exclusively in one tradition.
Okay. Marx, at least for a lot of thinkers coming from a more European influenced background, Marx is there at least vaguely. And so it's not particularly illuminating to say that someone has been influenced by Marx. But to give a background on myself, that I never really pursued academia. I had an opportunity at one point to do that. I have an interest in political theory myself, and I was briefly involved with a journal called Critical Review under the late Jeffrey Friedman. And so my general background is pretty classically liberal, and I've seen a new kind of right. I mean, classical liberal is on the right. It's a very tepid right, and just given the broad sweep of both continental and American political thinking, it's an extremely tepid right, and a right with peculiar American characteristics, and that is mainly their focus on free markets. And what we've seen in the past few years is the rise of a right that is not in love with markets. And so that sort of kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. I was not particularly familiar with that lineage, and today it still seems kind of foreign. It seems like I guess superficially, and this is an American way of framing it, it has, kind of big-brained white men in common, but these are sort of big-brained white men that are not enamored of free markets and everything that they might bring to our society, right? And so I feel like they're at the level of optics. It seems as if we should have something in common, but it's like reading to me, it's like reading a 2000s or 1999 era Adbusters, but from a conservative direction. So they're criticizing globalization, they're criticizing a kind of one-dimensional man thing, but they are not doing it from the left. And what do you think about the kind of emergence of this kind of muscular, non-market-oriented right in our discourse?
Well, that right has always been around. The creation of the market society, market liberalism, came against a background in which you had a bunch of old feudal aristocrats in European societies who were committed to traditional institutions, who came at things from a more scholastic point of view, influenced by Aristotle and Aquinas. That tradition has always been around. It rarely gets attention because it doesn't change a whole lot across time. It's broadly the same kinds of ideas. It's not the thing that is usually emergent or new in terms of what it's developing. What tends to happen is that people in different periods come to this tradition, often from outside it, in response to disillusionment with other things. So I think we are in a context where people are very disillusioned with the kind of libertarian or classical liberal right. They're very disillusioned with the left. And so there is some migration into that kind of G.K. Chesterton distributist strain, which is getting more attention from a significant chunk of people who I think not so long ago would have considered themselves libertarian in many cases.
Yeah, the libertarian to alt-right pipeline, that terminology, I remember hearing a lot in kind of the late 2010s. And of course, alt-right specifically has sort of faded as a term that we hear applied to this kind of crop of young and often anonymous kind of right-wing thinkers. And I guess it's been replaced somewhat with just kind of reactionary or just new right. In fact, I think new right is what you see a lot now. But yeah, a lot of the it's kind of more culturally, kind of muscular cultural right. When they point out that libertarianism, or when they argue that libertarianism is really sort of has won the day, and despite all the libertarian self-conscious libertarian types telling you that they are kind of these underdogs, these perpetual underdogs, because look at the size of the state, blah blah blah, nothing's really going their way. I think the new right criticism of that has a lot of merit when you understand that what they're really getting at is a kind of broadly cultural libertarianism, a kind of atomization. And so I think that's fairly undeniable that we've been kind of drifting in that direction. And so, with that said, a lot of the libertarians complaining that, well, if you look at the number of regulations, they haven't gone down, or if you look at the perpetual existence of IP and eminent domain, well, we haven't really won. I think they're kind of missing the point of this kind of new right critique of right liberalism, i.e. libertarianism in a lot of ways.
I think some of it is economic and substantive. A lot of it is to do with this sense that capital mobility, global financial capital, imposes certain constraints on states that limits their policy flexibility, pushes them to, say, lower tax rates on the rich than they otherwise would pursue, pushes them into labor positions on labor laws and wage policy and currency policy that they otherwise wouldn't pursue. And that, therefore, I think for a lot of people on the right, the answer to that is to, in some way, disrupt international trade, disrupt capital mobility, and make it harder for wealthy people to move money from place to place. I think that's a big part of their thinking. Of course, in point of fact, a lot of the candidates and parties that position themselves as interested in that sort of thing find that the economic consequences of disrupting capital mobility and international trade are very large, that the political costs of those consequences are likely to be large. So when they win elections or they get into office, they tend to shift the focus toward these cultural issues, in large part because they're scared to actually follow through on the logic of actually disrupting all of that mobility.
Yeah, there is an argument on the right that I guess is somewhat more grounded or realistic about economics, cultural right. There's an acknowledgement that they can't really go as full dirtbag left as they'd like to on economic questions, and so they sort of compromise by making domestic trade much freer, loosening up regulations to sort of offset the reining in of globalization and free trade. So trade between nations they'd like to see less of, but the economic consequences of that, without any corresponding kind of domestic freeing up of economics, can be pretty bad. But yeah, I remember reading a review of the NatCon, or National Conservative Conference in the UK, by Helen Dale, I believe her name is Helen Dale. And she's saying that, they are sort of bereft of strong economic reasons. They want to leave the old right's sort of confidence in economics and not so much confidence in the cultural realm. They want to leave that behind. They want to throw these old economistic conservatives, kind of right liberal conservatives, under the bus, but they don't have a strong replacement there. They don't really accept Marxist theory, but they don't want to be, you know, libertarian adjacent either. So they're running into some problems with what to do on the economic question. So I think that's sort of interesting.
Yeah, that's a big challenge if you're not going to do some kind of, very nationalization heavy kind of regimen. If you're not going to do major sectoral reform, well, what are you going to do? A lot of them start looking at pre-distribution schemes, but a lot of that stuff doesn't apply very neatly to the kind of industry that we have, to the kinds of economic sectors that now exist. And even insofar as it does, the cost of making that transition in terms of cutting those supply chains and redrawing them, it's very high. And in democracies where you have elections every few years, people don't give you a lot of time to try to make a case for there being a long-term benefit to going in a new direction. People will punish you very quickly for a near-term shock.
Yeah, I think a lot of the cultural right sort of pride themselves on not even dealing with some of these economic questions because they think having a focus on economics is what got us into this problem in the first place, the cultural problem that they are totally obsessed with. So yeah, they're kind of in a bind on that. But just more broadly, I think to go back to the kind of libertarian or classical liberal perspective that I cut my teeth on, you know, it did seem to be missing kind of a substantive cultural component. It tended to sort of dodge the cultural question and leave that to markets. You know, like let's say that, you know, you have these cultural conservatives complaining about education policy. The libertarian or classical liberal solution would have been put the money in the hands of parents and then you can send them to any kind of school you want. If it's Nation of Islam or Orthodox Jewish or some kind of evangelical school or some kind of Montessori, whatever, you know, just let them decide for themselves what they want to do. Let the market decide. And I think the right is this newer cultural right is correct in thinking that, you know, we can't really dodge these cultural questions, and now you're going to be forced to have an opinion about that stuff, and that's put them directly at odds with the left, which I think is also primarily concerned about culture. Although you have a kind of old, you know, economic left, it's trying to get back into the conversation. So to turn this into an actual question for you, do you think that cultural or economic forces are or rather the cultural question is paramount and that the economic question sort of follows from that, or are you kind of fundamentally economy or economistic oriented in that the culture flows from that? So the inverse.
Yeah, I would say I'm much more economy oriented. Certainly stuff like civic education matters. You know, the way that you prepare your citizens to participate in politics or in public life is important. But what I think a lot of cultural theorists drop out is that economic arrangements play a very, very important and central role in all of that. So even for people who are part of this right that want to make some kind of traditional, maybe Catholic argument about how things ought to be arranged, all of the traditional Catholic thinkers like Erasme or Aquinas recognize that to produce citizens who have virtue in a Catholic or Christian sense, you need them to have time to develop the virtues. That time has to be a non-instrumentalized time. So it can't be time that's spent, trying to make money or trying to, just obtain whatever it is that you need to obtain to survive. It needs to be time where you can be educated and spend time thinking about things and deciding what matters and thinking about what values are important, right? To create that time, you need some sort of economic system that generates a surplus of time, which can then be distributed to people. So it's not just that we need to distribute money or resources or property. There's also this question about time. People who are able to effectively participate in cultural discussions are able to do it because they have some abundance of time. They have time to think about these questions. They have emotional and psychological resources to approach them in a healthy and thoughtful way. These things require an economic system that distributes time to those people. And if you don't have an economic system that can distribute time to everybody, then that tends to, in a lot of traditional right-wing thought, lead to arguments for restricting who can participate in politics on the basis of who has access to the time. So in the case of ancient and medieval political theory, usually the argument is that only people who have time ought to participate, and therefore, that's the basis for according all of these privileges to the aristocrats who own the land, and because they own the land, they derive income from the land without themselves having to spend all of their time managing it personally. Left-wing arguments tend to focus instead on finding ways to get that time for everybody, to get everybody some access to time, access to enough time. And I think the thing that the classical liberal or liberal tradition has tended to do is that it's tended to argue that you don't need so much time to be able to be capable of doing these things, that these abilities will just come to you in the course of participation in business or in private life, that you'll just get them out of participating in the family or in civil society organizations. I think that would be the kind of Adam Smith take. And the trouble is that right now there are very few people who are persuaded by that argument that people will acquire positive traits, virtues, and so on through the distribution of time that the market operating on its own, of its own accord, will generate.
Yeah, what you just outlined is a very broadly liberal kind of knowledge and democratic participation as being valued for their own sake. And I see left and right radicals beginning to question why all of that is important. I mean, it feels, I think, from their perspective that all ought to be in service of something more culturally specific. So if you're part of the kind of new Catholic right or new integralist Sarab Amari type of thinking, the ability to participate in democracy is not inherently valuable. It's only valuable to the extent that it kind of cultivates a healthy living. And of course, you can describe what that is from a Catholic perspective, and then maybe from a left perspective, democratic participation is not particularly valuable if it results in just the ongoing cultural supremacy of white preferences or male preferences. And so I do see liberalism in this kind of John Dewey, or I believe you mentioned Robert Dahl in a piece that I read recently, these kind of classic vindications and arguments for democratic citizenship and participation that's somewhat culturally non-specific. They say it's just conducive to a very kind of generic, healthy well-being. People are starting to question all of that, and they're sort of filling in the gaps, or sort of filling in the blank spaces with culturally specific things they'd like to see. So I think liberalism is being chipped away at the edges with that kind of thinking.
Well, I think a lot of people on the left and right value participation, but they have a higher bar for what constitutes being able to participate effectively than a lot of liberals do. The big move that Benjamin Constant made in that famous work on the liberties of the ancients as compared with that of the moderns is to suggest that everybody can participate in democracy if you ask less of the citizens than you asked of, say, citizens of ancient or medieval societies, right? The argument that only, say, aristocrats or only very, very educated or well-situated people can or should participate is grounded on the idea that these people need to know an enormous amount about all the substantive issues. They need to really have a deep relationship with human values, because they have to actually make very pivotal decisions or contribute in major ways to very pivotal decisions. And the move that the liberals make is to say, well, if you just have to vote and your vote is one among millions and millions of votes, you don't need to know all that much. And you don't need to participate that heavily. It becomes possible for everybody to participate, even if everybody participates in relatively small ways. And so by reducing the amount of participation that's necessary, it becomes more plausible to argue that people don't need all of these virtues and advanced civic capacities that you tend to see in ancient or medieval right-wing theories, and also in left-wing and Marxist theories that want everyone to participate very heavily, or everyone to have these qualities or capacities which were previously reserved to only a few.
Yeah, the classical liberal approach to that question is they both believe that it's not really possible for the typical citizen to have the knowledge that they need to participate effectively in a complex society, and it's not any kind of slight against their intelligence. No one is intelligent enough to know what needs to be done. It's part of the broader Hayekian knowledge problem, dispersed local knowledge, and all of that. You could have a 200 IQ, and it's not going to solve the problem. We're just not situated such
Right.
that.
So in a way, it's the left and the right that really value participation for its own sake, because they say that the kind of participation that's possible in a liberal market society is too minimalist, it's insufficiently personal, and it's insufficiently thick. And it's because they want this much thicker participation that they then become absorbed in trying to generate these virtues and these advanced kinds of traits that they think are necessary for a person to be able to pull that off, right? The Hayekian says that's all fruitless. You can't generate those kinds of qualities in people, or certainly you can't generate them at scale among the whole population. And
Right.
therefore, you should have a more impersonal system that imposes a kind of neutral rule of law, impersonal institutions, and all of that. The left and the right are critical of that. They view that as totalitarian.
Oh, they say that is totalitarian? That's
Yeah. For them, because no particular people are making the decisions, all people are being enslaved by an impersonal system. Everyone is depending upon an impersonal system instead of developing the qualities and traits for themselves. And so in that sense, from that point of view, there's a relationship of domination between the impersonal system, whether that's conceived of as capitalism or it's conceived of as the modern democratic state, right? Those are impersonal institutions and structures which then particular people depend upon, and no particular person is in position to epistemically evaluate or criticize. So in that sense, all of the particular people depend on something external to themselves.
Okay, that's a very interesting. We can get into the definition of totalitarianism, and maybe this is just a manifestation of kind of vivid 20th century events, as well as my own research on classical liberalism and libertarianism and that general approach. Totalitarianism is thought to be something that is very deliberately coercive, not a kind of impartial system of the market type that is not reducible to anyone's intention to do something to you, do something nefarious to you, right? So everybody acting in their own limited capacity in the market can't be a form of totalitarianism. It can feel impartial. It can feel like it's incentivizing you in different ways in life, and it is, but that's not anything that somebody can. So yeah, so totalitarianism as something so impartial as to be just the manifestation of human action, but not of human design. So for the classical liberals, the right liberals, totalitarianism must be traceable to something that is human design.
Yeah. So these are two very different conceptions of what authoritarianism is, right? On the one side, you have authoritarianism as something impersonal where no particular person is in charge, right? So what is the authority is something that's external to human beings. And on the other side, you have a conception that's more like the ancient concept of tyranny, where you have one particular person or one particular body or organization or group ruling in an arbitrary way, making arbitrary interventions without any regard for rule of law. That's what Hayek is more focused on. But that is more similar to the ancient concept of tyranny than, say, the total society that's talked about by the Frankfurt School, which the Frankfurt School very much identifies with capitalism and market society, right? And the fusion of capitalism and the modern state, which the Frankfurt School Marxists regard as that's the total society. For them, that is what totalitarianism is. So I would say that this impersonal conception of authoritarianism and this personal conception, I think they're both valid ways of thinking about authoritarianism. And certainly a tyrant who just does whatever the tyrant feels like doing to you arbitrarily, willy-nilly all the time, it would certainly be terribly unpleasant to live under that as well. I think part of what goes on in political theory is that when we are worried about the tyrant, we tend to want to construct an impersonal system that constrains particular people and prevents any particular person from becoming a tyrant, right? And in the course of doing that, we make something that other people regard as totalitarian. And then when they don't like that, they try to empower particular people or groups or bodies so that those particular bodies can overcome the total system and impose whatever it is that they think is important, whatever values they think that system excludes or neglects. So I think there's a tendency for moves toward tyranny in response to totalitarianism and moves toward totalitarianism in response to tyranny. So in this sense, I would say that both the liberals and the non-liberals can generate authoritarian behavior from certain points of view. It's just that what liberals will tend to do is create impersonal institutions that look totalitarian. And what the left and right will tend to do is to create highly personal institutions that look tyrannical. But both of those things in an excess are a problem.
Yeah, I think it's kind of fascinating the way that, yeah, right. Everyone's got their particular vantage point, their particular way of describing a totalitarian system and a tyrannical system. So right now, you have, at least on the kind of resistance, more mainstream democratic left, you see them resisting the tyranny of a single figure known as Trump. But on the right, they believe that by putting their faith in Trump, they are fighting against the totalitarianism of this kind of impersonal woke bureaucracy that that exists in both government and corporate bureaucracy as well, in the private sector as well. So they both can tell themselves a story that they're resisting something despotic, something nefarious and terrible of a political sort, and they both have a germ of truth to it, at least.
Yeah,
So,
and they can both frame this as they're defending democracy from authoritarianism. And in this sense, I do think most of the people on the left and the right view themselves as pro-democracy and as Democrats.
yeah, and they are, and it just goes to show how so much of political thinking that we grow up with is missing a strong cultural element that I think with knowledge of you can get at what their particular problem is with seemingly culturally neutral political outcomes. So for instance, the left talks about reforming electoral college. In some parallel universe, reforming electoral college works to the benefit of the right instead of the left. And so I think there is a small number, a certain strata of thinkers who really are sort of enamored of liberal ideas for its own sake. And now, so I should just note that I'm veering us off into a different discussion here about how whether people are sincere about being in love with certain liberal traditions and norms, or rather they're it's just a kind of a way of getting at a cultural grievance in disguise. So yeah, what do you think about that? Do you think people are primarily animated by certain cultural outcomes they'd like to see, or they really are kind of in love with a sort of procedural liberalism for its own sake? What do you think?
Well, I think there are some people who are sincerely committed to procedural liberalism for its own sake. I think within the liberal tradition, you have on the one hand some people who genuinely and sincerely believe in something like an Adam Smith theory or a John Rawls theory, that people are reasonable or rational or can become or develop moral powers through participation in ordinary daily life, the kind of daily life that exists in a modern capitalist society. That if you go to social clubs, you go to church, you go and participate in advocacy organizations, that these will have a socializing effect that will give you the qualities that are necessary to behave, and that therefore democratic institutions and structures are ways of helping people to acquire these things, and there are also ways in which people can deploy these qualities. At the same time, there are also liberals who are more concerned that people are not able to get that kind of socialization from civil society as it presently exists. The Margaret Thatcher point that there is no such thing as society, if that's true, that's a very difficult problem for a liberal who's operating with something like an Adam Smith view or an Alexis de Tocqueville view to grapple with. And I see two different kinds of still liberal thinker, but liberal thinker who no longer believes that it's possible to, through civil society, prepare people for democratic participation. One would be someone like Hayek, who really thinks that democracy, even in its liberal form, is an impediment to the growth and development of markets and to the growth and development of impersonal structures. And on the other side, you'd have somebody like Max Weber, who believed that the liberals in his society were fundamentally politically immature, that they didn't know how to subordinate their private interests to the interests of the entire state in cases where there's a conflict between those interests, that they would pursue their own personal wealth in situations where that would endanger ultimately the entire system, which is necessary to continue and perpetuate liberalism. And I think that those two different views end up pulling in different but also kind of similar directions, insofar as they both lead to an emphasis from a liberal on a need for some level of authoritarianism to check the public. And I think that part of what's going on in liberalism right now is that there is a deep divide between those liberals who still think fundamentally that you can put your trust in discussion and in civil society, and those who think that that stuff has failed and that there's a need for a more muscular state which intervenes in the culture to protect markets.
Yeah. So the way you describe Hayek there, and people of his ilk, it sounds as if their main purpose is protecting the integrity of markets, but I think they believe that an individual's own flourishing is better served through civil society / markets than through being as political as many theorists would like them to be. So it's sort of a soft right, classical liberal Jordan Peterson type of thing. These are the people who think that thinking ideologically or thoroughly politically is actually not good for you, and even whether it's right or left.